Control yourself, and you control them. You are your vulnerability. Before you begin to read, look in the mirror. Do you see a personality? You are mistaken. You see a biological mechanism stuffed with social firmware that makes you an ideal victim. Right now, while you are breathing, someone more strong-willed, colder, and more free from illusions is already calculating your next reaction. You are a set of triggers. Press guilt, and you will give away your money. Press fear of loneliness, and you will betray your principles. Press vanity, and you will become a slave to someone else's opinion. Do you consider yourself safe because you follow the rules? Rules were invented by shepherds so that the sheep do not scatter while they are being led to the shearing. The world is not a cozy living room. It is a battlefield of wills. If you do not control your impulses, you are a tool in someone else's hands. Nietzsche did not teach goodness. He taught power over oneself as the only way not to become food. Your virtue is often merely your weakness, which lacked the courage to become strength. Welcome to reality without the decorations. There is no pity here. There is only strategy. Your ego will now be broken so that a steel spine may grow in its place. Chapter 1. Information Vacuum. The Art of Silence as a Weapon of Torture Phase. Collision. The Argus Group meeting room resembled a freezer. Mark felt the dry, sterile air of the air conditioner penetrate under the collar of his Egyptian cotton shirt, causing a slight chill. Opposite him sat Victor, his mentor, a man who had become a second father to him over the last 10 years. And it was this man who, just now, in a quiet, almost tender voice, deprived Mark of operational control over his own creation. We have decided that you need time to cool down, Mark. You are too emotionally involved in Project Synthesis. Elena will take over management for the transition period. Elena, sitting to the right of Victor, did not even look at Mark. She slowly adjusted the gold cuff of her blouse, and this gesture, deliberately calm and calculated, acted on the nerves more strongly than any insult. The air smelled of expensive perfume and ozone from the working office equipment. Mark felt heat boiling in his chest. It was anger mixed with the icy horror of betrayal. His pulse quickened to 110 beats per minute. Thoughts pounded chaotically in his skull. How could they, after everything I have done? It is my code, my architecture. His mouth opened slightly to release a cascade of accusations, to shout about injustice and broken agreements. Stop. Breathe, he commanded himself. If I speak now, I will give away my panic. I will show them where it hurts. They are waiting for my hysteria. They have prepared answers for it. If I start to justify myself, I recognize their right to judge me. He closed his mouth. Slowly, controlling every muscle of his face, he placed his hands on the polished Karelian birch table. He did not simply fall silent. He waited for exactly 12 seconds. In the silence of the room, only the hum of the projector could be heard, resembling a swarm of angry insects, and the barely perceptible creak of the leather chair under Victor. Mark looked directly at the bridge of Victor's nose, where the skin was slightly lighter due to muscle tension. Victor, who had expected a storm, justifications, or shouts, began to fidget. His right eyelid twitched almost imperceptibly. He took a pen, twirled it, and put it back. The contact was broken. Phase, psychological X-ray. What happened in those 12 seconds? In the moment of stress, Mark's amygdala, the ancient center of fear, was activated. A cascade of cortisol and adrenaline flooded his blood. The biological program demanded a fight-or-flight reaction. Verbal aggression is a social surrogate for a fight, a way to release tension through noise. Victor and Elena used cognitive suppression. They expected Mark to start justifying himself. Justification is an admission of someone else's jurisdiction over your conscience. When you justify yourself, you subconsciously accept the role of a subordinate who reports to a superior. You give the opponent data that they will use to finish you off. Mark applied an information vacuum. Silence in response to a direct attack creates a zone of absolute uncertainty. The aggressor's brain is programmed to receive immediate feedback to assess damage. When it is absent, the connection break effect occurs. An internal search for errors begins. Why is he silent? Does he know something? Does he have a plan B? Did I overestimate my position? At this moment, the aggressor fills the silence with their own worst suspicions. Their dominant position crumbles under the weight of their own anxiety. Phase. Counter-strike. Mark did not respond to the jab. He did not challenge Elena's appointment. Instead, he stood up, just as silently, and slowly gathered his papers into a neat stack. His movements were fluid, devoid of haste. He fastened one button of his jacket. At the very door, he stopped, slowly turned around, and uttered only one phrase, looking Victor directly in the eye. "Victor, I hope you understand what kind of door you have just opened. I will prepare the cases for transfer when I consider it necessary." He did not wait for an answer. He walked out, leaving them in a cloud of their own growing anxiety. Lesson number 1. Never justify yourself. Justification is an admission of someone else's jurisdiction over your conscience. Silence is the most aggressive action you can take under conditions of manipulation. Phase. Sensory immersion. The glass walls of the corridor reflected Mark, distorted and elongated, as if in a house of mirrors. The office architecture, built on transparency, actually served for panoptic control. Everyone saw everyone, and no one was safe. Mark felt his steps on the polished granite sound, too resonant, emphasizing the emptiness of his current position. Outside the window, the city stretched out, gray, cold, permeated with a grid of roads resembling capillaries under a microscope. In this city, only those who knew how to lie low survived. Chapter 2. False Vulnerability. The lame duck trap. Phase. Collision. 2 days later, Mark invited Elena to dinner. Reconciliation and discussion of the transfer of affairs. That was how he formulated the purpose of the meeting in a short, dry message. The restaurant was chosen to be deliberately pompous and noisy, where the sound of clashing cutlery and the hum of voices interfered with concentration. Mark sat at a corner table, intentionally slouching. His tie was slightly loosened, and the top button of his shirt was undone. Before him stood a glass of whiskey, which he rotated nervously, staring at one point. When Elena entered, she saw a man crushed by defeat. "Mark, I am glad that you decided to behave like an adult," she said, sitting down. Triumph sounded in her voice. She saw his slumped shoulders and took it for a surrender. "You won, Len." Mark uttered this almost inaudibly, without raising his eyes. His voice sounded hoarse. "I just want to understand. How long had you been planning this? I trusted you as I trusted myself. I taught you everything." He looked at her from below, pausing for 3 seconds. His lower lip trembled almost imperceptibly. He looked like a man who needed sympathy. She is going to swallow the bait now, Mark thought, feeling how his internal analyst cold-bloodedly measured the level of her self-confidence. Her ego demands confirmation of its greatness. She will not be able to resist bragging about how she outwitted me. Elena relaxed. Her dopamine system was exultant. When a predator is confident of a total victory over the victim, its vigilance drops to a biological minimum. "Oh, Mark, you were always too much of an idealist. You believed too much in the team and common goals." Victor had been looking for a reason for a long time. I simply helped him see reality. 6 months ago, when we were negotiating with the Mercury Fund, I changed your forecasts in the report. Victor thought you were losing your grip. She began to talk. At first cautiously, then more and more boastfully. She described meetings with investors in Dubai that Mark did not even know about. She enjoyed his humiliation, spilling the details of her intrigue. Phase. Psychological X-ray. Mark used the strategy of false vulnerability. In ethology, this behavior is called injury feigning. A bird pretends that its wing is broken to lead the predator away from the nest and lure it into dangerous territory. Elena fell into the trap of narcissistic expansion. When we see a defeated enemy, our ego feels the need to assert its superiority through a monologue. This is a biological mechanism for reinforcing status in a hierarchy. Her prefrontal cortex, responsible for control and caution, was suppressed at that moment by the limbic system, intoxicated by the dopamine of triumph. The reverse halo effect also worked here. She saw his defeat and automatically transferred this weakness to his intellectual abilities. She decided that he had ceased to be a threat, and therefore she revealed her cards. Phase. Counter-strike. When Elena finished her 20-minute monologue, Mark suddenly straightened up. His shoulders squared, and his gaze became sharp and cold. The slouch disappeared as if by magic. His face became symmetrical, a sign of absolute calm and confidence. "Thank you, Elena. That was very informative, especially the part about forging reports for Mercury. That is a criminal offense, did you know?" He slowly took a voice recorder from his jacket pocket, which had been lying on the table under a napkin all this time, and turned off the recording. His hand did not shake. Lesson number 2. People cannot help but boast about their evil. Create conditions for them in which they consider your humiliation final, and they will give you compromising evidence against themselves. Vanity is the shortest path to the scaffold. Phase. Sensory immersion. A thunderstorm began outside the huge restaurant window. Heavy fat drops beat against the glass, erasing the outlines of the city, turning it into a blurred spot. Inside the restaurant, it smelled of expensive perfume, heavily seared steaks, and old wine, the smell of civilized cannibalism. Elena looked at the recorder, and her face slowly acquired the color of wet concrete. She looked as if all the air had just been pumped out of her lungs. Chapter 3. Radical Pragmatism. The Death of Compassion. Phase. Collision. Victor summoned Mark to his country estate. This was a territory of power, 5 hectares of forest enclosed by a 3-meter fence with electrified barbed wire. In the enclosures, trained Dobermans barked, pure mechanisms of aggression. Victor stood by the fireplace in a huge living room paneled in dark oak. "Mark, I am told you are trying to play dirty games with Elena. That is low. We are family, after all. Do you remember how I pulled you out of that scandal 5 years ago? I paid for your lawyers. I saved your career. You owe me your life, boy." Victor used triangulation, appealing to third parties and shared values, and aggressively pressured Mark's sense of guilt. His voice was warm and fatherly, but his eyes remained dead. He approached Mark and placed a heavy, authoritative palm on his shoulder. "Leave it, delete the recording, and I will return your position as vice president. I give you my word as a man. We will forget everything, like a bad dream." Mark felt the heat coming from the fireplace, but inside him was permafrost. He looked at Victor's hand on his shoulder as the paw of a predator trying to hold its prey with kindness before biting its throat. He remembered how, 3 years ago, Victor convinced him to sell his mother's shares, claiming it would be safer for the family. In the end, those shares settled in Victor's personal safe through a chain of offshore accounts. He is using my gratitude as shackles, Mark thought. He appeals to a morality that he himself has violated 1,000 times. For him, morality is just software that he installs in the heads of his slaves to make them easier to manage. If I give in to a sense of duty now, I admit that he is my master. Phase, psychological X-ray. Victor applied classic gaslighting mixed with an appeal to sacred values. He tried to impose an old coordinate system on Mark, where gratitude and loyalty stand above objective interests and self-preservation. At the biological level, an oxytocin trigger was activated in Mark, the attachment hormone associated with a shared past. His brain desperately resisted the idea that his mentor was an enemy. This is an ancient psychological mechanism that protects against the pain of realizing loneliness in the pack. To win, Mark had to apply radical pragmatism. Nietzsche called this the revaluation of all values. This is the process of consciously turning off the emotional circuit of empathy in situations of existential threat. It is necessary to switch thinking to a pure algorithm mode. If Subject A systematically extracts resources from Subject B, Subject A is a parasite subject to neutralization, regardless of their rhetoric. Phase, counterstrike. Mark carefully but firmly took Victor by the wrist and removed his hand from his shoulder. He did this slowly, looking directly into Victor's pupils, which appeared narrow like those of a reptile in the light of the fireplace. Victor, your word as a man has a market value of 0. We are not family. Family does not forge the reports of its members and does not steal their shares. We are two wolves in one territory where there is only enough food for one. You yourself taught me that morality is a luxury for those who have already won, and I am still in the process. He took documents out of a folder, printouts of transactions from Panamanian accounts that he had found using clues fished out from Elena. Here is evidence that you have been robbing the board of directors and investors for the last 7 years. Your family ties have cost the company $200 million. You have 24 hours to announce your voluntary resignation. Otherwise, these papers will land on the prosecutor's desk. Lesson number 3. Morality is a tool of control created by the weak to restrain the strong, or by the cunning to fool the naive. In strategic conflict, compassion for the enemy is a form of betrayal toward oneself. Phase, sensory immersion. The room smelled of old leather, expensive cognac, and burning from the fireplace. These were the smells of power that had begun to rot from within. Outside the window, the autumn wind whistled through the bare branches of the trees, tearing off the last leaves. Nature knew no pity. It only followed the laws of entropy and the struggle for survival. Mark stepped out onto the porch, and the cold air burned his lungs, bringing a strange feeling of liberation. He was no longer a son. He had become a force. Chapter 4. Destruction of reality. Who is insane here? Phase. Collision. Victor did not give up. The next morning, Mark discovered that his access to all corporate resources was not merely blocked, but erased. His personal accounts were frozen at the request of the Argus Security Service in connection with an investigation of an attempted theft of funds. But that was only the beginning. Elena called him through a secure messenger. Her voice was full of feigned, almost hysterical sympathy. "Mark, dear, what have you done? Victor is horrified. Those documents you showed him. You do understand that it is nonsense. These are forgeries planted on you by competitors. We have called a psychiatric team for a consultation. You are overworked, Mark. You are seeing conspiracies where there are none. By evening, his friends and former colleagues began to send messages such as, "Mark, we heard about your breakdown. Please see a doctor." His mother called, crying, "Mark, they told me you have paranoia. You threatened to kill Victor." Mark sat in his empty apartment on the 42nd floor. The phone was bursting with notifications. He felt reality beginning to double. What if they are right? A poisonous thought flashed. What if those files really were forgeries? What if I am going crazy from stress? His hands began to shake. In the silence of the apartment, the hum of the air conditioner seemed like the whisper of hundreds of voices discussing his fall. Phase, psychological X-ray. This was the highest stage of psychological warfare, destructive gaslighting. The goal of the manipulator is to destroy the victim's very foundation of their own perception of reality. When a person is broadcast the same lie from all sides through different channels, family, friends, colleagues, their brain, as a deeply social organ, begins to adjust to the opinion of the pack. This is called perceptual conformity. At the biological level, this causes a state of ultimate inhibition of the cerebral cortex. The organism falls into a state of learned helplessness. At this moment, the victim is ready to accept any version of reality that the aggressor offers, if only to stop the unbearable cognitive pressure. Victor and Elena used triangulation, drawing Mark's loved ones into the manipulation to deprive him of his last point of support. Trust in his family. Phase. Counter-strike. Mark approached the window and pressed his forehead against the cold glass. The pain from the cold helped him ground himself, returning his attention to his body. He began to list facts aloud, slowly and clearly, that were absolutely verifiable. His name, his passport number, the contents of the documents he held in his hands. Then he made a move they did not expect. Instead of defending himself, justifying himself, or proving his sanity, he decided to take their legend to the point of absurdity. He recorded a video message and sent it to Victor. "You are right, Victor. I am not myself. I see things that others do not notice. For example, I see how your bank in Zurich will close a week after I send them a copy of your crisis state. I am leaving for a clinic. Do not look for me." He turned off the phone and threw away the SIM card. Instead of a clinic, he went to a cheap motel on the outskirts where he could not be tracked by GPS. He understood. To win the war for reality, one must temporarily step out of it. Lesson number 4. When the enemy tries to declare you insane, do not argue. Put on the mask of a madman. This will give you freedom of action that normal people, bound by the rules of logic and decency, do not have. The most dangerous person is the one who has nothing to lose, including their mind. Phase. Sensory immersion. The motel room smelled of bleach and cheap tobacco. A blinking neon sign outside cast rhythmic pink reflections on the walls, resembling the pulsation of an open wound. Mark sat on the bed, feeling absolutely empty. He had left everything in that former life, his reputation, his fears, his illusions about truth. He became a ghost, and like a ghost, he could now pass through any walls. Chapter 5. The Halo Effect and its Dismantling Phase. Collision. A week passed. Victor was celebrating a final victory. At the annual Golden Lion charity ball, he looked like an emperor in a perfectly tailored tuxedo with a glass of vintage champagne, surrounded by a halo of success and unshakable stability. Elena sat nearby, dazzling the guests with diamonds that Mark had once helped her choose. Investors and politicians approached Victor, expressing sympathy regarding the tragic insanity of his protege. Victor nodded with noble sadness. This is a great loss for us. Mark was talented, but his psyche could not withstand the pace. At that moment, when the celebration reached its peak, the doors of the hall swung open. It was not Mark who entered. It was a representative of the state financial market regulator, accompanied by 4 police officers. The music of the orchestra stopped, replaced by a ringing silence in which only the heavy breathing of hundreds of people could be heard. Mark stood on the balcony of the second floor, hidden by the shadow of a heavy velvet curtain. He saw Victor try to use his charisma. "Gentlemen, this is some kind of misunderstanding. We are at a charity evening." "My lawyers!" His voice was still authoritative, but the halo effect began to crumble like plaster from an old, rotten building. The guests began to instinctively move away from Victor, creating a vacuum around him. Phase, psychological X-ray. The halo effect is a cognitive bias in which a general positive impression of a person, their wealth, confident tone, social status, is automatically transferred to all of their qualities. People believed Victor not because he had evidence of Mark's insanity, but because Victor looked like a man who could not lie so brazenly. However, this effect has a critical point of destruction: cognitive dissonance. When an element radically contradicting the perfect polished picture bursts in, police, accusations of serious crimes, the observer's brains experience shock. Trust crumbles instantly. Those who a minute ago admired Victor are now the first to throw a stone at him to prove their lack of involvement in his fall. Mark did not fight Victor's image personally. He understood that his word against Victor's word was worth nothing. He used an external legitimizing factor, the law. Against a cold, bureaucratic machine, personal charisma and social capital are powerless. Phase, counter-strike. While the police read Victor his rights and camera flashes cut through the gloom of the hall, Mark slowly descended the stairs. He did not gloat. There was not a shadow of triumph on his face, only deep, icy focus. He approached Victor at the moment when the handcuffs clicked on his wrists. "Do you remember you said I was too emotional?" Mark asked quietly, almost in a whisper. "Today I feel nothing. Nothing at all. You yourself burned everything human out of me. Now reap the fruits of your work." Lesson number 5. The strongest reputation crumbles to dust if you strike not at the person himself, but at the rules on which his world rests. Destroy the scenery, and the actor will become just a pathetic old man in a ridiculous costume. Phase, sensory immersion. The smell of expensive champagne mixed with the smell of the cold sweat of frightened guests. It became unbearably bright in the hall from the camera flashes. This light was like flashes on a battlefield. Mark felt a strange lightness, as if he had shed a heavy shell. He watched as Victor was led away, and the lights of the crystal chandeliers were reflected in his eyes, cold and indifferent, like stars. Chapter 6. The dopamine loop. Addiction as a management method phase. Collision. A month later, Mark occupied Victor's office. Now he was at the top of the pyramid. Elena, who managed to avoid arrest thanks to timely cooperation with the investigation, which Mark himself had organized, came to him. She was frightened. Her usual self-confidence had been replaced by subservience. "Mark, I know that I was wrong, but I can be useful to you. I know all of Victor's secret schemes, all of his offshores. Give me a chance to redeem my guilt. I will be your most faithful dog." Mark looked at her. He saw how her fingers, clutching an expensive bag, were trembling. He did not drive her away. On the contrary, he gave her an office even more luxurious than before and appointed her as his personal advisor. He began a game. On Monday, he showered her with praise, promised a share in the profits, and said that she was the only person he trusted. Her eyes shone. She worked 20 hours a day. On Tuesday, he ignored her calls, answered questions coldly, and made it clear that he was disappointed with her last report. He created an ideal dopamine loop for her. Elena became obsessed with his approval. She caught his every look, trying to anticipate his mood. She turned into Mark's shadow, ready for any meanness for the sake of a short smile from her new master. Phase: psychological X-ray. Mark applied the method of intermittent reinforcement. This is the most powerful way of forming psychological and biological dependence, used in gambling and social media algorithms. When a reward is given not according to a clear schedule but unpredictably, the brain releases 3 times more dopamine in anticipation of success. Elena turned into a laboratory rat in a Skinner box. Her will was paralyzed by the constant expectation of the next portion of approval. Mark did not just control her actions. He re-engineered her neurochemistry. She could no longer leave because, outside of this system, her life seemed empty and devoid of meaning to her. At the biological level, this leads to chronic adrenal exhaustion. Elena was in a state of constant micro-stress, which her brain mistakenly interpreted as passion for work or loyalty to a leader. Phase: counter-strike. 3 months later, when Elena had prepared a most complex scheme for him to swallow up competitors, having done all the dirtiest and most dangerous work for him, Mark summoned her to the office. Before him lay the order for her dismissal and a ban on her entering the building. "You are free, Elena. Your services are no longer required." She looked at him, her face twitching with a nervous tic. Her brain, tuned to receive another reward for titanic labor, simply refused to process the information about the break. "But why? Mark, we are a team. I did everything for you." Lesson number 6. Never allow the tool to think that it has become the master. Keep your enemies on a leash of their own hopes, and when they are exhausted, cut the leash without hesitation. Dependence is the most reliable form of loyalty, but it works only as long as you are willing to be the dealer. Phase: sensory immersion. Sterile silence reigned in the office. The air was saturated with the smell of expensive coffee and ozone. Mark looked at Elena, and she seemed to him like a tiny insect trapped in a drop of amber. Her scream seemed to him like a distant, indistinct noise. He opened his laptop and began to work as if she had never existed. Chapter 7. Territorial Dominance. Body language phase: collision. A new test was the visit of Salim, the head of the largest investment fund of the East. Salim was used to people groveling before him. He entered Mark's office without waiting for the secretary's invitation, surrounded by 2 silent bodyguards. Without saying a word, Salim walked to Mark's desk and sat not in the guest chair, but on the edge of the desk itself, violating all boundaries of personal space. He loomed over Mark, looking down at him. "Listen here, boy. I do not care about your squabbles with Victor. I need my dividends, or tomorrow I will withdraw all capital, and your empire will fold like a house of cards. You have 5 minutes to convince me not to do this." Salim used territorial seizure and a demonstration of physical superiority. His posture was that of a dominant primate in a pack. Mark did not move away. He did not lean back, which would have been a sign of submission. Instead, he slowly, very slowly, stood up. This forced Salim either to get off the table or to find himself in an absurd, almost intimate, face-to-face proximity with Mark, who was now taller than him. Phase: psychological X-ray. Salim used primitive biological markers of rank, seizing space looming over the opponent, a direct, unblinking gaze. These are universal signals of aggression in higher mammals. Mark applied a status inversion. By standing up, he regained his vertical advantage, but the key factor was speed. Accelerated movements are read by the opponent's amygdala as a sign of an adrenaline rush, panic. Slow, fluid movements are a sign of a high level of testosterone and self-confidence. Mark demonstrated that he did not perceive Salim as a threat. Also, Mark used open postures. He did not cross his arms, he did not cover his neck. In body language, this means, I am so much stronger than you that I do not need protection. Phase. Counterstrike. Mark did not start arguing about figures or justifying himself. He approached the window, putting his hands behind his back. Salim, if you withdraw the capital, you will lose 40% of the profit in the next quarter. You will not do this because you are greedy. And greed is the most shameful form of slavery. You came here not to threaten, but to bargain. Sit in the chair. We will speak on my terms, or we will not speak at all. Mark endured a pause of 5 seconds, looking out the window at the panorama of the city, completely ignoring Salim's presence. This was the highest manifestation of dominance, depriving the opponent of attention. Salim was silent, his nostrils flaring with anger, but a moment later he slowly climbed off the table and sat in the chair. Lesson number 7. Your body speaks louder than your words. Never show haste. The master of the situation moves slowly, breathes deeply, and is not afraid to leave his vulnerable zones open. Dominance is not a shout. It is the calmness of a rock against which waves break. Phase. Sensory immersion. Outside the window stretched the city. Its jungle of concrete and steel seemed endless. The sun was going down below the horizon, coloring the sky the color of clotted blood. Mark felt the vibration of the city being transmitted through the soles of his shoes. He was part of this rhythm. A predator that had found its pack and subjected it to its will. The office smelled of leather and steel, the smells of a new reality. Chapter 8. Strategic Absence. The pathos of distance phase. Collision. When the company reached the peak of its power, and Mark became the most mentioned person in the financial news, he did something that no one expected. He disappeared. For a month he did not appear in the office, did not answer calls from the board of directors, and did not give interviews. His social networks fell silent. A quiet panic began in the Argus group. Without his rigid control and daily instructions, the structure began to vibrate. Managers began to gnaw at each other for influence. Investors showered the company with inquiries. Rumors appeared. Mark is ill. Mark has been kidnapped. Mark is preparing a secret deal to sell the entire company. The stock price began to fluctuate. Victor, who was under house arrest, tried through his lawyers and his remaining loyal people to organize a coup in the board of directors. But every time his people took a step, they ran into legal traps prearranged by Mark, which were triggered automatically. Mark, at this time, was in a small house on the shore of a cold sea in Norway. He sat on the veranda, wrapped in a woolen blanket, and looked at the gray waves, sipping strong black coffee. Before him was only one laptop with an encrypted communication channel. Phase, psychological X-ray. Nietzsche called this the pathos of distance. Strategic absence is a most powerful tool for managing the mass consciousness and the individual psyche. In economics, this is called the law of scarcity. While the leader is available, he is commonplace. As soon as he disappears, he turns into a myth. People are inclined to endow an absent leader with almost divine abilities. Fear of the unknown forces enemies to make mistakes, trying to anticipate your next move, which in reality may not even exist. You force them to fight with their own shadows. Furthermore, this is the best way to identify traitors. In the absence of the master, the dogs begin to bark louder. Mark simply observed which of his circle would be the first to run to Victor or start leaking information to the press. Phase. Counter-strike. When the tension in the board of directors reached the point of explosion, and Victor was already prepared to announce the necessity of external management, Mark returned. He entered the meeting room in the middle of a dispute, without warning, dressed in a simple sweater rather than a tuxedo. His silent presence alone was enough to make all the conspirators immediately fall silent. The company's shares rose by 15% in an hour on the mere news of his return. "I saw everything you were doing in my absence," he said, without sitting down. "The list of those who will leave the company today is already with the security service." Lesson number 8. Your presence must be a valuable gift. Your absence, an unbearable punishment. Become a rare resource. He who is always at hand is cheap. He whose appearance changes the course of history owns the world. Chapter 9. The Mirror of Resentment. Slave Morality Phase. Collision. At the end of his journey, Mark met with Victor for the last time. The court had deprived the old man of everything: property, reputation, hope. He sat in a cheap station cafe, his hands shaking as he tried to bring a cup of cheap coffee to his lips. "You have become a monster, Mark," Victor wheezed, and a poisonous hatred flared in his eyes. "There is nothing human left in you. You betrayed everyone who loved you. You walk over corpses. Do you think you have won? No, you have simply lost your soul. You are the embodiment of evil." Victor was almost screaming, attracting the attention of the rare visitors. His face was distorted by a grimace of arrogant suffering. This was classic resentment, the slave morality of the weak trying to wound the strong through accusations of immorality. Mark looked at him with the cold curiosity of an entomologist studying a rare species of insect. He felt not anger, but a slight squeamishness. Phase. Psychological X-ray. Resentment is a poison that the weak drink themselves in the hope that their enemy will die. Victor could not admit his defeat in an honest struggle of wills, so he tried to move the game into the plane of good and evil. When a person cannot achieve power, they begin to declare power as evil. When they cannot be strong, they elevate weakness to the rank of virtue. This is a defensive mechanism of the ego that allows the loser to feel morally superior to the winner. Mark did not enter this dispute because he understood. The categories of good and evil are simply labels with which people mark what is beneficial to them or what threatens them. Phase. Counter-strike. Mark placed a banknote on the table covering Victor's bill for a whole month in advance. "You do not hate me for my methods, Victor. You hate me because I am you who saw the matter through to the end. You stopped where you became afraid of being lonely. I went further. Your morality is simply an attempt to justify your failure. Farewell. We will not see each other again." He walked out of the cafe without turning back to the old man's shouts. Lesson number 9. Do not allow the sense of guilt that the losers try to impose on you to slow your step. Their morality is merely a form of their impotence. The only sin in the world of predators is indecision. Chapter 10. Amor fati. Love of fate. Phase. Collision. Mark stood on the roof of his skyscraper. The wind at such a height was fierce. It tried to push him down into the abyss of the night city's lights. He had achieved everything. He was the master of his fate and the fates of thousands of people. He had lost everyone: his mentor, his friends, the woman he once considered close. His heart was cold and hard as a diamond. For a moment a thought visited him, deep as an ocean trench. Was it worth it? Every minute of this hell, every betrayal, every drop of ice in the soul. He looked down. The city pulsed like a living organism, and he felt its every thread. And at that moment he felt a deep, vibrating delight. He did not regret a single second. He loved his pain, his mistakes, and his victories equally strongly. Phase, psychological X-ray. This is the highest point of Nietzschean philosophy, amor fati, love of fate. This is a state where a person ceases to be a victim of circumstances and becomes their creator. He does not simply accept what has happened. He wishes for it to have happened exactly that way and in no other way. Mark completely integrated his shadow. He ceased to fear pain because pain is a tool for calibrating reality. He ceased to fear death because he had lived his will to the limit. His psyche reached the state of the overmen, Übermensch, a being who creates their own laws and their own values in an empty universe. Phase, counter-strike. Mark turned around and walked toward the exit from the roof. Tomorrow there would be a new day, new challenges, and new predators who would want to displace him. And that was beautiful. One more time, he whispered Nietzsche's words to himself. Let us go one more time, exactly the same way. Lesson number 10. Control yourself, and you control them. But remember, the highest power is not power over others. It is the ability to say yes to any fate of yours and live it as a triumph of will. Now you are closing this text. You have received the keys to the cage in which you sat all your life. But remember, knowledge without will is just another illusion of security. You may know all the laws of psychology, but if you falter at the decisive moment, this knowledge will become your curse. The world is still inhabited by predators, and now you are either one of them or you will become food again. The choice is yours. No, do not dare to complain about injustice anymore. Now you know how it is structured. Note: in this study, psychological models based on the works of Friedrich Nietzsche and modern ethologists are used. The use of these techniques requires absolute self-control and an understanding of the consequences for the psyche.